So, good morning, folks. Thanks very much for coming along to this session. This will be the least technical session that you're going to attend in your entire time at this conference. My name is Fintan Ryan. I'm an industry analyst with a firm called RedMonk. Before I go any further, how many of you here have heard of RedMonk as a firm? Right, it's a reasonable showing. So, we're a little bit different to most industry analyst firms. We take the viewpoint that developers really, really matter, and we position ourselves as being a developer analyst firm. So the phrase developers in that context to us means developers, DevOps, operations, product manager, basically anyone who's actually doing stuff rather than doing stuff on a PowerPoint slide, which ironically is what I'm doing here. The firm itself is around 13 years. I'm only there about a year. My background is around enterprise software. Prior to joining the firm, I actually ran the CoreOS meetup in London, which as soon as I became an analyst, and considering we've multiple clients that are in competition with CoreOS, I obviously had to give that up pretty quickly. But I've spent an awful lot of time around the operating system space and kind of low-level kernel space in my time. So the topic of the talk today is about the container ecosystem and CoreOS. So let's talk a little bit about ecosystems and what ecosystems are. So the general definition of an ecosystem is always thought of in terms of biology. Okay? And it's an interesting way of looking at it. But there are other ways of thinking about what's involved in an ecosystem, what's actually involved in an ecosystem involving humans and involving technical communities. And when you start getting to communities, it becomes a very, very different thing. This becomes no longer just straight dependence. It becomes people interacting with each other and how people are actually starting to use what other people are developing, how other people are feeling about things, where things emerge, all this kind of stuff. And that actually ends up leading you to conversations. And one of the things that's really, really boring when you're talking about ecosystems and stuff is having someone just stand in front of you and talk about them and not actually have any form of conversation. So I'm going to ask people a question at the start, and we'll take a vote on it, and we'll decide what way this presentation is going to go. But before I do that, I'm going to ask you all to do one thing. Okay? I want you to turn around in the room, find someone that you don't know, and say hello to them, and talk to them for about a minute and a half or so. Can we manage that in here? Cool. Thanks very much, folks. I now get to be really rude and interrupt all the conversations that we've just started. And it's funny, there's certain people I can see here that I know that are going to keep talking no matter what. Okay, folks, so conversation. As I said, conversation is a key part of what communities are, and it's a key part of ecosystems. So I said earlier I was going to ask people to take a quick vote on the way this talk is going to go. I can do the talk in two different ways. I can stand up here for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and I can go through stats, and I can go, this is what's interesting, and this is what's happening in GitHub. You're going to get that either way, but I can do it for a long time, or I can do it for a short time. If I do it for a short time, what I'd like to try to do is actually get everyone here involved in a conversation. How many people here have ever been at an on-conference? Right, there's a couple of people. On-conference. It's the exact opposite of something that's really structured and organized. Would people like to spend the last 10 or 15 minutes of this session having a discussion among everyone that's in this room about what ecosystems and communities are? If you're interested in doing that, please raise your hand. And if you're not interested, I don't know, keep your hands down. So, anyone interested? It's only about a third of the room. Okay, so we will say no to that idea. Very quickly, I will explain what it would have been. These are red cards. What we would have done is we would have got a couple of people from the audience up here. We would have selected people with random, by the basis of random questions. The first four people become a panel, and they get to answer things. Everyone in the audience gets a red card. If someone gives an answer that's complete and utter bullshit, you get to red card them. The trade-off of that is that you got to take their place on the panel. It's a really good way of actually getting discussions going in kind of informal groups if you ever want to try it. Now, the trade-off of all of that is that you get to listen to me rabbit on about stats and communities and various things for the next 20 minutes or so. So, ecosystems. I mentioned the kind of definition of a biological ecosystem. We start talking about people, I think urban ecosystems are a much, much more interesting way of actually trying to understand how communities grow and how things build. So if you start off and you start looking at what's a house, what's the basic building block of a city, what's it like the basic building that starts appearing. And when we start talking about the container space, we can go all the way back and we can take a look at C groups and LXC and things like that, and we can kind of go, okay, that's the initial building blocks. But for most people, the initial building blocks happened with two particular events. One was Docker emerging, and for a lot of people in the audience here, it's Rocket emerging. This is the only time I'm actually going to have a direct comparison between Docker and the CoreOS product in this talk. Given where we are, this graph in itself, and this is one that we actually don't use in any of our publications that we put out because it doesn't really make a massive amount of sense because of the momentum that Rocket has or that Docker has in terms of the straight mind share. But what this really does show is the amount of people that are just really, really interested in containers and are trying to use them now. We're all sitting here and we're all right on the front edge of that curve. When you start going out and you start talking to people in other places, they kind of look at you and go, what in God's name are you talking about? So as an interesting example, I chaired the containers track at QCon London a couple of weeks back. QCon London is a big, big developer conference, about 1,500 people there. And part of what you do at QCon is you stand up in front of the entire audience and you try to pitch your track for 2 minutes, which is an absolutely horrible experience because talking for 2 minutes is much, much harder than talking for 20. But you stand up and you give your pitch and you ask things. So I decided to ask how many people are here are using containers. And I sit in the middle of this ecosystem expecting half the audience to put their hands up, about 10% put their hands up, and you're kind of going, okay, that's really not great. So once you get outside of our own ecosystem and where we are, you start to realize that there's a huge amount of education and adoption to go on. Then you move on from your straight building and you start looking at a street and you start looking at what things are around, what stuff is a little bit more interesting in the overall space. And that brings you to the projects that CoreOS themselves are very heavily involved in. And this is, again, GitHub stars growth. So I can and do similar graphs and similar comparisons for people who are committers and for issues. And generally, we actually look at companies. And in the context of what this conference is, talking about companies is really not the most interesting way of looking at things. But you start seeing the kind of growth of the different projects now. etcd is, and I will come to this again in a moment, is a linchpin project. It's kind of the core thing I think that an awful lot of people find and start working with CoreOS in. If you haven't entered from the operating system side, you tend to enter from using etcd. Then there's the other projects that are all starting to emerge. So obviously things like DEX have just started out, so they're quite young. But if you take a look at the other projects and the general interest levels in them, there's a pretty nice trajectory in each one of them. And what we tend to see when we're looking at trajectories of communities and how they're growing is once the curve is kind of on this level and starts going up, it's a pretty solid community. It's going to stay there. When you see the curve kind of flatten out and stuff, it's when you start seeing projects die off. And we do see that occasionally around the cloud native space at the moment. You don't see it. Every project is going really, really quite nuts. But these ones are much, much further up the list than where most people are. Now, I mentioned the concept of etcd as a linchpin project. What makes it kind of interesting is when you start taking a look at, okay, who's interested in something like etcd and who's interested in some of the other projects, and you start tying all of that information together. So where we start seeing this is like, who are fleet users looking at etcd? Are they interested in it? Again, as I said, stepping back from committers, because some of the committers will be common due to the company base of things, but in terms of users and what we're seeing with users talking about, you start seeing this one project creating momentum in other projects, and when something is announced that's linked with, we'll say, etcd, then people kind of go, okay, yeah, that's interesting, I'll take a look at that, and start playing around with it. And we start seeing these commonalities start to occur, and these various communities come together, and different tools starting to be combined together. What we found kind of interesting is something like Claire, or Claire, do we pronounce it Claire or Claire? Claire. So something like Claire is quite an interesting one, because for a lot of people, it's not overly interesting. But once you start understanding what the necessity of it is, it becomes very interesting. And in terms of a security project, it's actually unusual for us to see something with that level of interaction with some of the other projects that are out there, it's a nice thing to see. But then you move from a building and a street, and you move up to kind of a city block level, and then that's when you start getting everything that's appearing around you. And that moves us to other things that are around there. The most obvious one of today being Prometheus. Prometheus getting announced as being accepted into the Cloud Native Compute Foundation yesterday. There's a lot of involvement. Obviously, its home is here. It's a really, really interesting project. Prometheus is something that we see a huge amount of momentum with again, a huge amount of crossover with people. When you start looking at stuff like Prometheus and what people are trying to do, that's when you start hitting the Google's infrastructure for everyone else in a real kind of understanding. This is building on and replicating tools that exist within Google and trying to figure out, okay, how can we do this, and how can we take it outside and do it at scale? And the approach and kind of the growth of this kind of thing around the cloud native ecosystem is really, really interesting, and around the container ecosystem is really interesting. The other projects that are here, so I'm going to kind of run through these. Very quick disclosure, I worked for Weaveworks at one stage in the past, so that's why Weaveworks is up there. But as we kind of look through these, how many people here have ever played with something like Zipkin? No? Okay. Zipkin is a really, really interesting framework that's come out of Twitter. It's a distributed systems tracing framework. You combine something like Zipkin and Prometheus together, you start getting some really, really good analysis, good ways of actually analyzing what's happening within your system. You go a little bit further and you start taking a look, I just know that I generated these graphs this morning, in case you're wondering, so the repo not found problem is, that's quite interesting. That was Google RPC, and I can see where the problem is because I've got a spelling mistake in there. gRPC is another tool that we're seeing a huge amount of growth with. Again, similar kinds of combinations of tools and how people are pulling them together, but particularly around microservices frameworks and how they're going to be monitored, we're seeing a lot of stuff around the RPC layer starting to occur. And again, there's these projects that are plugging into the ecosystems that companies like CoreOS are creating, which is making it really interesting to see. The other one that's also interesting there is Calico. Obviously, we had the announcement yesterday of the moves with Calico. So I've kind of, again, going back to having worked with Weave, I came across the Calico guys on quite a regular basis because we used to kind of almost be up against each other trying to give presentations about container networking. But it's really interesting to see, again, this kind of the companies that are getting spun up and being created out of the ecosystem. But then you get to a bigger view, and you get to the city view. And this is where it all gets interesting. So Kubernetes. Many people here are using Kubernetes. That's a reasonable amount. How many people have played with Kubernetes? Much better amount. So Kubernetes is turning into a phenomenon. This is some data I pulled about 2 months ago, and it is the meetups that are existing with Kubernetes around the world and the growth in the different meetups. There's a couple of obvious hotspots where there is a big presence of people. So in San Francisco and London, there's a huge kind of hotspot in terms of the kind of the velocity of the meetup and the amount of people that are attending the meetups and the demand for them. But what's interesting with it is actually just to see kind of the geographic spread, because this has moved very quickly out of being just something that exists inside the market in San Francisco, and it's become a much bigger phenomenon. Part of that is the momentum that Google are putting in behind it themselves. They are investing a hell of a lot of money in publicizing Kubernetes, which is good for all the rest of us, I think. But the other part of it is that it is solving a very, very interesting problem. And it is a problem that we're all going to face as we're developing applications into the future and how we're actually going to maintain our infrastructure. What is interesting to watch in terms of this momentum is the momentum here is actually kind of overtaken. So I have a similar topic graph for Mesos, and the momentum has kind of overtaken Mesos over the last kind of 6-7 months. Prior to that, awful lot of interest in Mesosphere and Mesos, and now it's kind of moved over to Kubernetes. This comes back and kind of reflects on the fact of how young the community is and where we all are in terms of adopting the various types of technologies. In particular, if you kind of think about early adopters and people playing around with things, Kubernetes is very attractive to go play with at the moment, whereas Mesos was very attractive last year. What is interesting is we don't see anything emerging at the moment that's going to replace these. This is kind of where the momentum is. It's GitHub trajectory is pretty straightforward. It's just a straight line. It's the same trajectory line as we've seen with Docker in the past. The momentum is really quite strong. The biggest complaint that we keep hearing, and which is obviously is getting addressed by a number of companies, CoreOS being one of them, is installing and getting the thing configured in the first place. That's something that people are really, really struggling with. And we're seeing various kind of moves to try get all of that resolved. The other part that was interesting with it, though, is actually to take a look at the meetup and try and understand what's happening with the meetups and the velocity around those. And the number of people attending the meetups and expressing interest in attending meetups about Kubernetes has overtaken the number of people on GitHub. We don't see this very often. This is an unusual one to actually see. This shows a different type of momentum in an ecosystem, and it's quite cool to actually see because it shifts things off just being focused around GitHub onto other things. The other one is the number of people asking questions on Stack Overflow and what they're doing there. So again, there's a pretty significant velocity. What was nice is the dip there is actually at Christmas time, so people actually did take a break, which is refreshing because at times it really doesn't feel like this industry kind of stops at all. But coming back to etcd as a linchpin, the number of people who are interested in etcd and the intersection of those with the number of people who've expressed interest in Kubernetes is over 40%. That at this stage of the lives of these projects is actually a really, really quite significant thing to see. It kind of shows where these key projects are starting to come together. The thing with all of that and all the stuff around the ecosystems, all of that's around just the technology part. So there's a much bigger question in the ecosystem, which is education. And it's education both among ourselves and among the community and about how we do things, but it's also education of a wider variety in terms of how people go back into their organizations and businesses and how do you actually talk about the technologies. How do you sell the business value of playing around with this stuff? Part of what my job ends up being is that we spend time as well as we spend most of our time talking with people who are developers, but we spend a relatively significant chunk of our time talking with CIOs and that kind of level of folks in organizations. And when you start talking with them about cloud native, at the moment their eyes glaze over. They get the idea behind it, but they're kind of going, I don't get why we should be doing this yet. And this is kind of large traditional organizations. So there's a whole question that we all have in terms of how do we explain the value and how do we explain how Kubernetes, how cloud native, how a whole lot of it can actually be used. And I think this was actually summed up best by Kelsey Hightower, who used to work for CoreOS. And this is a tweet he did last year. And one of the problems I refer to as the tyranny of the green, which is the aiming to have the whole green streak on GitHub, and that's your sole measure of how successful things are. And there are so many other things that actually need to happen in an ecosystem, how things need to be addressed, things that need to be done. And that comes back to this teaching, comes back to documentation, it comes back to explaining what the value of things are to people and trying to work through all of that. And that's kind of, I think, if there is a weak spot in the ecosystem at the moment, that's where the weak spot is. It's trying to explain the value outside of the ecosystem and the echo chamber that we all exist in. Because it is an echo chamber where we all are. We all think everyone is doing this stuff, and it really isn't that way. So that's kind of my ramble through the ecosystem. So at that stage, I'm going to stop and go, do we have any questions?
Sorry, do you think organizations like CNCF are stitching this ecosystem together, or is there a driving force, or is it organic?
I think originally it was organic. I think organizations like CNCF have a very important role to play. It's interesting. So I don't know if actually, I think Chris Onachek was around earlier on. He's down there. So Chris will probably be able to answer some of the CNCF questions as well. But the creation of these organizations to kind of just give a little bit of structure around it, it becomes, when I was going to that kind of explanation into businesses and into organizations, it becomes a much easier thing to explain when you kind of go, here is what a bunch of corporate companies think is actually of interest here, and this is how it should be, this is how they're going to try govern projects and how they're going to help people in the community. Secondly, it allows people to feel relatively confident about the structures around things. So one of the concerns, and to everyone in this room, this kind of concern doesn't register anymore. But one of the concerns that you still get in large organizations and in large companies is very much this thing of, it's open source, I don't want to go near it, blah, blah, and that FUD is still there. It's gradually disappearing, and easily at this point the majority of organizations aren't concerned about it, but you still do get that a little bit. In terms of the organic side of it, I think we are going to continue to see a bunch of new projects emerge for a while. I tweeted a thing the other day that I love the momentum, but the not invented here syndrome drives me insane about what we're seeing at the moment. So there is an awful lot of not invented here syndrome. We will see that continue for probably another 18 months, 24 months would be my guess. That's generally what you see as these kind of ecosystems emerge, and then things will consolidate completely around a few areas. It is pretty obvious that a couple of key consolidations are happening. So things like, and they are, as it happens at the moment, they are focused around the CNCF. So things like Kubernetes going in there, Prometheus has gone in there. If you take a look at the technical oversight committee mailing list, there's discussions of various other things happening as well. So yeah, to answer your question, I think they're a guiding force, and they will help things, and it will gradually transition from organic into something a little more structured. Yeah.
Hey, Fintan. One concrete question. You said it was unusual, the amount of meetups or something for the communities. Maybe you could elaborate on that a little.
Yeah.
And the second question would be on your thoughts on standards like container standards and CoreOS roles and things.
The container standards question, I knew that one was going to come up at some point. No, I don't blame you. The meetups one on the first part, so let me delve into a little bit what I mean here. So, as I said, one of the things that looking at GitHub is that's people who are directly interacting with stuff generally at a source code level and are quite comfortable doing it. There are a lot of people who just want to use the software. They're not actually that interested in playing around with it and tweaking with the latest version. They want to take a stable version and use it. An awful lot of those people start to attend meetups kind of 6 to 12 months after a technology gets popular. So in the case here, we're looking at kind of about 6 months. The curve kind of suddenly started to increase quite rapidly. What you're seeing at that point is people who are coming out of let me step back a bit. They're people that are relatively early adopters that are within organizations that are looking at things, and I've kind of gone, okay, I need to go find out a little bit about this, and I need to start playing it. They also start appearing at meetups when you start getting talks. So one of the ones that was interesting in London is that there was a talk given, I think it may have been speaking here as well, Ivan, I can't think of his second name, he's currently working for the government digital service in the UK, or maybe HMRC in the UK. But when he started giving talks about using Kubernetes in production, you saw a sudden spike in the number of people that were attending and a different type of attendee. That's kind of where I'm going with that, is that you get this interest point that appears. What's made this unusual is just how quickly the interest point has occurred, and how many people that are not direct people playing around with the technology are actually attending the meetups and kind of going, yeah, I'm interested in this and I'm interested in it from an operations side. So hopefully, does that answer that question? Okay. Container standards. Container standards. I think that having a basic standard is a very good thing. I think that genuinely for an awful lot of technology, I think it's a good thing to actually do. But there's a question of how it's positioned and how it starts to emerge. I think there are things around container standards at the moment that are happening. There is obviously some competition between particular vendors in terms of how they would like to see this go. I think it will settle down. What will make the standards part of it more interesting is you step back from the direct people in the ecosystem, you start looking at the big enterprise players. So you start looking at IBM and HP and Oracle and all those guys. They want to see it standardized because they don't want to lay a really big bet on this stuff until it's in a position where they're able to play around with it, and that will drive part of the standardization. If you look at the way some of these bodies emerge, there tends to be a certain part of a corporate overstructure that kind of drives things in a particular way. The short answer, I think standards are a good thing. So, does that answer that question?
Any timeline you see in this type of thing?
So the question was any timelines that we see for a standard. I follow some of the discussions. I don't see a timeline that I could state at the moment. I think we will get there, and I think something will happen that will drive it all there. But there's a bit of work to happen yet. Yeah.
So I really love the use of data to inform this kind of analysis, like the number of people who like etcd who also like Kubernetes is really interesting. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on sort of what, I hear a lot that containers is like an echo chamber, right? That it's a lot of our industry doesn't use them, X, Y, and Z. But I was wondering if you had specific sort of reasons why you brought that up as a big point, and if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, so I brought that up as a point for two particular reasons. One, it is something, so I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago to the London CTOs meetup, and there was like 14 or 15 CTOs of various size companies in the room. And I asked, how many of you are using Docker? And I got 2 hands. QCon one, again, very small amount of the audience. I've had similar experiences at multiple different conferences, with the exception of container-specific events, where you kind of go, how many people are using containers, and you get 25 to 30% of the audience at this stage. There's sometimes more saying that they're using them in production, and an awful lot more using them for development and test. So we kind of have to think about where these technologies are emerging from, and what the approach is, and the hesitance that you get in large organizations. So that the hesitance in large organizations isn't about the technology per se, it's about all the other stuff that goes with it. So it's kind of like, what's the security? Does it integrate with my ORBAC system? Do I have traceability? It's all of that kind of stuff that holds it up going into organizations. Do organizations and do CIOs and stuff get the value of it? Yeah, they do. They fully do. But they are terrified of adopting a technology that increases their risk profile. Their job is to mitigate risk. As much as you'd like to think that the people who are running technology in organizations, their job is to give you the best technology. It's not. It's to eliminate risk and make sure they don't get sued. So that's where the kind of concern is. Again, that's where the commercial aspects of what's emerging in the ecosystem is very, very important, and the companies that are emerging that are building in the various things. So like CoreOS have a very, very strong focus on security. Docker things around the whole tool chain. There's various things that are happening, and you got other companies that are emerging that are trying to address different parts of it. Again, we'll see some consolidation there. It's like you got companies like Twistlock emerging that do security stuff and things. But yeah, so back to the echo chamber thing. So I've kind of rambled there, I know. To the echo chamber point, again, when you come to these events, people really are using the technology and get what it means, which means you don't need to convince them. It's convincing people of why you should use the technology is what I'm referring to about the echo chambers. Okay.
Do you have any comparison between where container stands in terms of production compared to VMs today?
Compared to VMs?
Yeah.
Do I have any direct stats? No, but it is single digits percentage-wise at the moment. VMs are the majority of everything out there. And again, back to the education point, there is a lot of education still to be done with people that containers are not just VMs. There's a whole other set of work that has to happen from the community there, but it's very low at the moment. It is increasing, and it's increasing quite quickly in comparison to that. But if you look at VMware and the transition, the kind of VMware pattern is what we refer to this as, that took about 12 years to actually run through. This one will happen an awful lot faster, but it's still very early days in it. Cool. Well, thank you very much, folks. Hopefully it was of interest to you all, and I'm floating around afterwards if anyone would like to grab me for a conversation.